When the movie begins, a man is seen trying to escape from being chased by the cartel. He is Dan Mason, and he had problems with the cartel. Despite his effort to escape, the cartels managed to surround him. Then the leader of the cartel, Hatcher, challenged him to a duel before he was taken to the hideout, but Hatcher was no match for him, who could beat him without breaking a sweat. Hatcher then told his men to bring Dan to their hideout. Upon arrival at the hideout, Hatcher and his men begin to torture Dan very brutally. It was revealed that Hatcher and his group were soldiers who once served in Afghanistan, but then defected and became drug cartels. Dan turned out to be a soldier too, and Hatcher considered that he had disturbed their business. He told Dan that he had visited his family in the morning and slaughtered his mother, even his father, who was a veteran. Dan was devastated, but he couldn't do anything about it because he was tied. Hatcher asked who Dan worked with and who else knew about his business. Dan, who didn't want to answer, made Hatcher mad, and in the end, Hatcher killed him by stabbing him in the back of his neck. Somewhere else, in a city, was a masked man who was slaughtering criminals. He intended to save a girl who was kidnapped by them. It was known that this masked man was John Gold, a former major in the military. The next morning, after John finished showering, he received a voice message from Dan's father, which was sent a few days ago. In this message, Dan's father asked John to come to the village because his family was in danger. Of course, John was too late because Dan's family had been killed by Hatcher and his men. It was revealed that John had previously been raised by Dan's parents, and he considered Dan his younger brother. That same day, John rushed to the village to visit Dan's family house. When he arrived, John went inside only to find the house empty. When he checked, he realized that there had just been a murder in this house the day before. John contacted his informant to get a little information about what happened, and a few hours later, John, who had received news from his informant, was seen already in the morgue. A doctor there said that Dan was found dead in the forest with hit trauma all over his body and a stab in the back of his neck and the back of the neck. But the police had not found the perpetrator and what the motive was. After that, John and his informant went to Dan's parents' grave. He apologized because he couldn't protect the person who had cared for him since he was a teenager, but he promised that he would find the perpetrator to take revenge. On the other hand, there was a mysterious man with long hair watching John from afar. After that, John went to Dan's family's barn to look for clues, because that place was where Dan and his father often spent their time. Not long after that, John found a recording that had been kept in the book, and when the recording was played, it contained Dan's father's voice explaining who Hatcher and his group were. Dan's father said that Hatcher was a sergeant who had 20 years of experience in the U.S. Special Forces, until one day he was sent to Afghanistan to lead the troops there. After returning from his duty, Hatcher and his troops stayed in this village and started a business. He was sure that Hatcher and his group had done dirty work in Afghanistan, so he asked Dan to investigate it. Hearing all this, John thought that it was most likely someone who had killed him, and Dan was Hatcher's group. In the evening, John went to the only bar in the area and loudly asked all the visitors to tell him who had killed Dan's family. It seemed that no one wanted to answer the question. At the same time, Hatcher and his group were in the VIP bar and clearly heard John's voice, but Hatcher told them to remain calm. The bar owner, who didn't want a commotion, tried to calm John down, and he asked him nicely to just leave their village. John said that he would never leave until he found the perpetrator who had killed Dan's family. He also said that he would challenge anyone who was offended by his words to a duel outside the bar. Before leaving, one of the women named Rose said that she knew Dan's family well, and that if John wanted information about them, he could come to her restaurant at the end of the road. John came out of the bar and found Hatcher and his group outside. One of them told John to immediately leave the village before something horrible happened to him, but John was not at all afraid. He immediately threw the cigarettes as a form of challenge, but when a fistfight was about to occur, Hatcher asked the man to finish the problem later. After Hatcher and his group left, one of the barmaids named Sandra said that she was Dan's good friend, and she was willing to help John find the information he wanted. She then took John to one of her friends who was an addict. On the way, John asked if she was also an addict, and she confirmed it. Upon arrival at this destination, they met Sandra's drug addict friend, Keith. Without further ado, John asked what he knew about Dan's family, but Keith showed an attitude that made John annoyed. After John taught him a lesson, Keith finally said that he didn't know much about Dan's family. He then said that he was a dealer until Hatcher's group came from Afghanistan and took over his business and the market. They also often acted harshly, even once injuring his hand. Upon hearing all that, John asked Keith to take him to the place where Hatcher and his group usually sold their product, but since Sandra also knew about the place, she would be the one to take him there. In short, John and Sandra arrived at the location. The place was guarded by many bodyguards. One of them was the one who previously almost got into a fistfight with John at the bar. When they tried to enter, the guards immediately chased them away. But when Sandra said that she was just coming to buy their product, the guard asked her to come alone. John secretly put a bug on her clothes and then got into the car. The guard then called Hatcher, who then told him to do something. The man then approached Sandra and immediately gave her a cell phone. He said that he would give the goods for free if she wanted to tell him where John would be staying that night. Sandra, who happened to be an addict and was also afraid of the man, was forced to tell him. On the other hand, John found out about their conversation. Soon after, Sandra came out and told John to immediately leave the village. She was afraid that John would suffer the same fate as Dan's family, but John remained silent and then asked her to take him to Dan's family's barn. When they arrived, Sandra asked to stay with him, but John refused and told her to leave immediately. After that, Sandra went to a quiet place and used the drugs until she fell asleep in the car. Not long after, she was shocked by a telephone call which turned out to be from the man who gave her the drugs. She then told him that John was staying in the barn belonging to Dan's family, but she asked the man not to hurt John and just scare him. Meanwhile, John heard all their conversation. He then prepared everything to welcome Hatcher and his group. The next morning, several mercenaries were sent by the Hatcher to finish off John, but when they were about to enter the barn, John had predicted their coming and finished them all very easily. John took one of their cell phones and sent a photo of their dead bodies to Hatcher. Seeing the message, Hatcher realized that John was not just anyone, so he asked his female subordinate to find out John's identity. In the afternoon, John went to Rose and asked what happened to the village, as it seemed so different compared to 5 years ago. Lots of bad people and addicts roaming around. Rose explained that this all happened after the arrival of Hatcher. They often get into trouble and sell drugs to people around. John asked why she didn't just move to another city and start a new life, and she answered that she couldn't leave her restaurant. Plus, she also had a younger sibling who was still at school. She then told him about Dan's family, who were very kind and often ordered food from her place. After talking for a while, John finally left the place. Sandra seemed to feel guilty because she had told Hatcher where John was and thought she might be dead already, but shortly after, she was shocked by John, who was still alive. She didn't think that John would survive. John then asked her to meet the man who gave him the drugs earlier. 30 minutes later, Sandra finally met the man, but when the man asked what she wanted, John suddenly appeared and pointed a gun at the man. Cornered, he asked John to remain calm. Suddenly, the guards arrived and a fierce fight broke out. In the end, John managed to kill all the guards. Before killing the man, John asked where they got all their stash. The man answered that it was all from Afghanistan. John then asked why they killed Dan. The man instead told him to ask Sandra and her addict friend, Keith. After that, John without hesitation killed the man, took all the money there, and before leaving, he set fire to the place. On the other hand, Hatcher's subordinate had managed to get information about John. John was a major in the army, and the military nicknamed him as the Fighting Machine. However, 4 years ago, he left the military and disappeared without a trace. He once had a mission with Dan in Eastern Europe and had been raised by Dan's parents. Hearing that, everyone realized that John's reason was to avenge Dan's death, meaning that he was alone because he didn't receive direct orders from the highest commander. Not long afterward, one of Hatcher's subordinates contacted to inform that the drugs warehouse had been burnt down. Not only that, the guards there had also been killed. Hatcher was of course furious with this information and knew that the perpetrator was John. He immediately asked his subordinate to look for John and finish him off. John was seen visiting Keith. He immediately asked about the death of Dan and his family. Scared, Keith finally told John everything. It was revealed that Dan managed to find out that Hatcher and his group were going to work with the cartel from Amsterdam. Dan planned to report them to the highest commander, but then he discovered it. Hoping to get some money and maybe half of the market, he immediately invited Sandra to report Dan to Hatcher. Hearing all this, John immediately prepared to finish off Keith, but he decided to let him live. John then went to meet Sandra, who was being held in the trunk of a car, but at the same time, Hatcher's man came. Then there was a shootout between them and a chase happened until the man met Rose, who was throwing away the trash, and made her his hostage. John begged him to let her go because she was innocent. Fortunately, Rose managed to bite the man's hand and John finally fought him. In the middle of the duel, John's stomach was stabbed and he was cornered, but fortunately, Rose helped and things turned around. While pointing a gun at the man, John asked where Hatcher was hiding, and after the person told him, he killed the man without any hesitation. He then took the man's cell phone and sent a message to Hatcher that they had to prepare to die. After that, John took Sandra out of the trunk of the car. There were also the police, including the mysterious man, who had been watching John since yesterday. John told the mysterious man not to bother him yet. In the afternoon, John was seen in the barn with Sandra. Sandra apologized to John because she had reported Dan to Hatcher. She swore that she didn't know that Keith had come to Hatcher to complain about Dan. John decided to forgive her and said that she was the real victim. She had become an addict, and it would make her suffer for the rest of her life if Sandra didn't stop. The next day at Hatcher's hideout, many of the guards were waiting for John because they were sure that he would definitely come. Meanwhile, John and Sandra were not far from there. Before infiltrating the hideout, John asked Sandra to call the number written on the paper if he didn't return within 15 minutes. He then quickly prepared his weapons and then walked to the hideout. After managing to infiltrate the hideout, John had to face one of Hacker's lackeys that John, without the slightest mercy, killed. On the other side, the person whom Sandra had contacted had arrived, and he turned out to be the mysterious man. Sandra said to the man that John had not returned for more than 15 minutes. Meanwhile, Hatcher ordered his female subordinate to go downstairs to fight John. But then, knowing well John was stronger than her, she asked John to let her go and promised not to fight him. But then John suddenly appeared from behind, then without hesitation finished her off. Long story short, John met Hatcher upstairs and the two were going to have a duel. Before that happened, Hatcher had the time to tell John everything. It turned out that when Hacker and his group served in Afghanistan, they robbed the Afghan drug cartel, then took their stash home to America and distributed them in this area. His group did this because they felt they were getting underpaid by the government and better off being dealers. John, who didn't want to hear it, immediately attacked him. Hatcher managed to corner John and was about to finish him off, but suddenly he was shot. It turned out that the one who shot him was the mysterious man who came with Sandra. Before leaving, the mysterious man took important data belonging to Hatcher's group on the laptop. The next day at Dan's funeral, the mysterious man approached John and invited him to chat. It was revealed that the man was John's superior in the military who had been looking for him. It turned out that the man wanted John to return to the squad because he was the best they had ever had, but when the man was off guard, John vanished from there. Later, Rose found a large bag in her, and when it was opened, it contained a lot of money with a letter from John asking her to move to another city with his sibling, while John would follow later. Meanwhile, John himself seemed ready to leave the village, but before long, Sandra appeared and wanted to come with him. At first, John refused, but she insisted on coming, so John finally took her.